Greece is doing something absolutely insane right now. It's actually kind of thriving. Yeah, I know. Yeah, you're looking at me right now. Color me shocked. Many of you come onto this channel and we jump from one nation to the next, explaining just how something is, well, destroying itself. And yet here, we have Greece, a country that is quite literally famous for its crippling debt and crisis year after year after year for, honestly, probably the last 200 years that it has existed. And yet somehow, at this point, it seems to actually be turning itself around. In fact, what is so insane about the thing that I'm talking about here now is that Greece is planning on paying off its loans that were granted under the first of 3 debt crisis bailouts by 2031. Is that 6 years away at the time that I'm making this video? Yes. But it is such a big deal because the payments, which will come in 5 billion euro or $5.7 billion annual increments, is going to allow Greece to pay off its debt a whopping 10 years before the loans were set to expire in 2041, which is actually when they were expected to pay. How are they doing this though? Well, announced recently, in 2024, the Greek government actually managed to achieve a budget surplus of 1.3% of its GDP. Exceeding its target of a 0.7% deficit. Yeah, that is right. They expected that, like many countries, the majority of countries on this planet, that they were going to run a slight deficit, which is pretty much what everyone does, and instead the Greek government actually made money. Now, not only is it amazing on its own, but when you again compare that to other states, that surplus is significantly higher than the EU's average deficit of 3.2%. We're talking billions of dollars here that the government now has in its hands that it is capable of using. The result? Well, it's using it in what has to be arguably one of the most popular moves a government has done in recent years. The government of Greece is straight up helping pay the rent of its poorest citizens. Yes, Greece's prime minister would announce this last month around 1 billion euros in financial benefits for lower income households. In order to tackle the housing problems that many different countries are facing, renters will have the cost of 1 month's rent returned to them each November starting this year, while at the same time, 250 euros, or nearly $290 per year, will be given at the end of each November to older, disabled, and uninsured people. Now, from the get-go, that doesn't necessarily sound like a lot. Yes, I get it, but remember here, the average annual salary in Greece is only around 17,000 euros, or 1,450 euros a month. So getting 250 of that back for people that don't work is pretty big. And if you want to think about someone having 500 euros in rent or something like that and getting it back, that is massive. That is a decent portion of one's yearly income. The finance minister of Greece would say that the rent returns would be allocated to households according to annual income levels and would apply to a whopping 948,000 households. Which you may think, we're not talking people, households. How many is that then? Around 80% of all renters in Greece, while the 250 euro benefit would apply to a total of 1.4 million people. An additional 500 million euros per year would also be paid into the country's public investment program to speed up public infrastructure and social projects and, quote, amidst international instability to increase investment so that new jobs continue to be created, end quote. As one can imagine, this has been a pretty popular move, but it brings up a very important question. How did we get here? How has the debt-ridden problem child of Europe managed to turn itself around and seem to get its act together for all intents and purposes? Well, let's talk about it. But in order to do so, we will need to actually explore some context.
September 480 BC.
Now, when I say that, yes, my friends, for you all here who are watching this right now, I know my reputation, but we are not going to be going back through 3,000 years of Greek history to explain a modern financial recovery, or problem for that matter. That would be insane. Just about as insane as trying to source B-roll or images in order to make this video in the first place without getting copyright struck. But hey, that is where today's sponsor, Storyblocks, comes in.
Which, no, seriously, my friends, I know that right now this is a transition into an ad, but for all of you who are watching this, you have no idea, just no idea how incredibly easy this sponsor has actually made my life. No, I kid you not, I have been trying to get sponsored by Storyblocks since the very beginning of me starting YouTube. Essentially, with a simple all-in-one subscription with Storyblocks, you can get everything that you need for creating media projects, all in one place. 4K and HD video, it's there, templates, music, sound effects, images, and so much more. I am not exaggerating when I say, do you have any idea just how fast I will now be able to pump out videos, considering how I finally have access to actual proper assets? My editor is crying tears of joy right now, which is honestly different than the usual tears that he's probably crying every time I send him an hour-long deep dive video. But hey, that's besides the point. With Storyblocks, you can streamline your workflow, you can save time, you can enhance the production value of the videos that you have with ease, and mind you, there are thousands of pre-made video templates for editing programs like After Effects, Premiere Pro, Apple Motion, and DaVinci Resolve. In fact, you can access the entire Storyblocks stock library directly with Premiere Pro and After Effects with the Storyblocks plugin for Adobe Creative Cloud. And of course, for any aspiring content creators out there, everything that I'm talking about here, when you download it with Storyblocks, it is 100% royalty free. So I'm telling you this right now, if you want to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/historyofeverything or click the link down in my description. Thank you so much, Storyblocks, for sponsoring this video, and I look forward to everything that will be happening here in the future.
Anyway, my friends, going back into Greece, no, we are not going to be doing 3,000 years. We're going to be covering 200 years in rapid order. And the whole reason we are even going back that far in the first place is because I need you all to understand, for those of you watching right now, the jokes that people make about Greece and debt are real. They are real. Debt has been a recurring problem for the birthplace of civilization from the very birth of its modern self. Yes, the modern Greek state is something that was born out of a successful war of independence against the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled Greek lands for the previous 400 years after taking them from the Byzantines. The war began in 1821, and the great powers, that being Britain, France, and Russia, would go and intervene on the side of the Greeks, which would lead to the establishment of an independent Greek state in 1832. Which, yeah, okay, that's amazing and wonderful, of course. Greece is free, but here's the thing. There's a huge problem from the get-go. Debt. War is expensive, after all, and 11 years of it will really do a number on one's finances, to say the least. To finance its development, as well as to stabilize its economy, Greece would turn to foreign loans, primarily from the British, French, and German banks. Now, these loans were oftentimes secured with extremely high interest rates and very strict repayment terms. As a result of difficulties in paying this debt, Greece would default on its foreign loans in 1843 due to a combination of economic mismanagement, political instability, and war reparations. The default would lead to severe economic downturns, and Greece during this time would face high inflation, a devalued currency, and a real lack of any kind of proper foreign investment. The government struggled to provide basic services, and public discontent would only grow with time. The financial crisis would exacerbate existing political tensions within Greece, and different political factions would naturally blame each other for the varying economic woes that were harming the country, leading to frequent changes in government and further economic uncertainty, which, as you can imagine, would only create further political instability. Yeah, as one could guess, this would mark the beginning of a prolonged period of financial crisis that, when I say prolonged, I mean that this would basically continue off and on in some way, shape, or form all the way throughout World War II, with multiple defaults and restructurings occurring during this time. The financial crisis and the subsequent intervention by European powers is then something that would have a severe and lasting impact on Greek politics. It fostered a sense within the Greek state that they were dependent upon other powers, and that even their political system was not independent and free. That too was subordinate to foreign powers. Now, my friends, when I talk about this is all obviously terrible, but there's a ray of hope. Something that modern Greeks hope has now come once again in the 21st century, and that is the Greek economic miracle. You see, to explain the context of this, Greece was occupied by the Axis powers back during World War II, which led to, as you can guess, significant hardship and resistance. This occupation was followed by a brutal civil war between communist and anti-communist forces, which would last from 1946 to 1949. After the devastation from the conflicts, Greece was pretty much in ruins. The economy was in shambles, and the country faced significant challenges in rebuilding its infrastructure and restoring stability. However, thankfully, with the help of international aid, especially from the United States through the Marshall Plan, Greece would, with time, begin the process of reconstruction as well as industrialization, transforming what was a mostly agricultural economy to a state that was filled with modern, light manufacturing. Over the course of 1960 to 1973 alone, Greek GDP would average a growth rate of over 7% annually. This, mind you, was second only to Japan in this time period, and it seemed that nothing could stop it. Well, that is, until something did, and the entire thing came crashing down. I'm going to need to explain this in the first place, but the imposition of a military junta in 1967 would bring about political instability and repression to the country. The junta's policies, including suppression of political opposition and many human rights abuses, created an environment that isn't exactly suitable for wide-scale economic activity, and as such, foreign investment in the country declined, and the economy began to suffer from a lack of consumer confidence. Fast forward a little bit of time, and the fall of said junta in 1974 and the subsequent transition to democracy, this is something that is better, yes, but it is also a very tumultuous period. The political uncertainty and social unrest that followed the junta's collapse is something that further disrupted economic activities and investment, and these were only made worse by Greek economic decisions at that point. You see, in the early 1970s, the Greek government adopted something called expansionary fiscal policies. This included increasing public spending and subsidies in order to be able to support the public and its own industries. Yes, while these policies did aim to stimulate economic growth, to be sure, they also led to severe budget deficits and inflation from basically printing money and pouring it into the system. This became exceptionally painful after the 1973 oil crisis because, go figure, when the cost of fuel goes up, so too does everything else. The sharp increase in oil prices led to higher production costs. It led to higher inflation and a deterioration of the balance of payments. Greece, which in comparison to a lot of other states is heavily dependent on imported energy, was especially vulnerable to these shocks and changes in oil prices. It became harder and harder in order to service its debt, and the government continued to mollify the people through welfare, and in general, the country just became trapped in a vicious cycle of stagflation, where the economy was stagnant, it wasn't really growing, but things kept on getting more expensive anyway, which means people were able to buy less and less and less. And as they bought less, it means that, oh, go figure, the businesses are going to suffer, they're not going to produce more, which in turn means that, hey, people start losing their jobs. That is pretty much the way that things would roll for a while, but the major problems would only really come about with the creation of the EU. Now, when I talk about this, my friends, I'm not talking about how the EU itself is a problem, not anything like that. This is something more of Greece's involvement with the EU would create, well, a lot of the memes that you probably see on the internet when talking about Greek debt. You see, under the leadership of center-right Prime Minister Konstantin Karaminlis, Greece would become the 10th member of the European Economic Community, which is the forerunner to the modern EU. In 1992, the 12 member states of the EEC would go and sign the Treaty of Maastricht, which would establish the EU in the first place. In addition to a shared foreign policy and judicial cooperation, the treaty also launched the Economic and Monetary Union, the EMU, which would pave the way for the introduction of the euro, the single currency, which would be launched in 1999. Yeah, for a lot of people who are watching this right now, who maybe are younger, you may not even remember a time in which the euro did not exist. It has only been around for a couple decades, really less than 3. Which is cool, but for Greece, there's a little bit of a problem. See, Greece, unlike the other members of this organization, was unable to adopt the euro because it failed to meet the fiscal criteria that were necessary to do so in the first place. Those criteria being inflation below 1.5%, a budget deficit that was below 3%, and a debt to GDP ratio below 60% as outlined by the Maastricht Treaty. Again, all of this was put in place to make sure that countries with severe financial problems did not join the EU and then as a result have to get basically propped up by the other member states. Considering that this was happening to one of the founding members of all of this in the first place, you can probably get that this whole debacle was a little bit embarrassing, and Greece then does everything that it can to adopt the currency, except, well, actually fix its problems. It does manage to adopt the euro in 2001, however, in order for that to happen, the country misrepresented its finances, with a budget deficit that was well over 3% and a debt level that was above 100% of GDP. It was subsequently later made public that the US investment bank, Goldman Sachs, is actually the entity that helped Greece to conceal its debt in 2001 through a series of very complex credit swap transactions. I'm not really going to explain that in detail as to exactly how this took place, but basically note that Goldman Sachs pretty much fudged the numbers, or at least helped Greece to fudge its own numbers. Alright, but hey, it's fine. Greece is in the EU. Does it fix its finances then, because now it actually should be able to? No, it gets worse. Fast forward 3 years, and Greece goes on to host the 2004 Summer Olympic Games, which cost the state around 9 billion euros. Remember, this is a state that is heavily in debt, and they go and do this. As you can probably guess, they didn't just find a bunch of money somewhere. This whole thing was funded through more debt, which meant that the state that year had a deficit of 6.1%. Remember, again, the whole thing with the EU was that you were supposed to have below 3%, and they were 6.1, over double that. Their debt to GDP ratio would rise that year to 110.6%. They really, at this point, are unable to hide their finances. And so as a result, the European Commission places the country under fiscal monitoring in the year 2005. But hey, it's alright. It's alright. It's not a big deal, right? It's not like, pretty soon there's going to be some major world-shattering financial crisis that is going to occur in the next couple of years that could plunge the entirety of global markets into chaos. Oh, no, wait, no, that's exactly what happened. Yeah, it's a milestone in this channel every single time I end up talking about it for any modern problems, but we had the 2008 financial crisis, which wrecks everything. Yes, the US subprime mortgage market would collapse after the housing bubble burst the year prior. The US crisis would ultimately trigger a global banking crisis and credit crunch that would last all the way through 2009, which would completely crush the financial behemoth Lehman Brothers and would prompt government bailouts of banks in the United States and Europe. As a result of this, borrowing costs would drastically rise, and financing for any kind of debt-fueled projects would completely dry up. Greece became unable to service its mounting debt. In fact, when I talk about this, my friends, this problem was so much worse than anyone had ever anticipated. In 2009, the newly elected socialist leader of Greece, a guy by the name of George Papandreou, would go and reveal within weeks of getting elected that, hey, Greece's budget deficit, that whole thing that was around like 6 or so odd percent, which, yeah, that was pretty bad. Yeah, no, that wasn't around 6%. That year, it was going to exceed 12% of GDP, nearly double the original estimate. But wait, it gets worse. That figure is later revised to 15.4%. Remember, if your deficit is greater than 3%, that is something that was pretty bad to the EU. They didn't want you to be a part of the whole system. Greece's GDP debt at that point became 15.4%. Their borrowing costs, as you could probably expect, would spike as credit rating agencies would downgrade their sovereign debt to junk status in early 2010, meaning the entire thing was pretty much worthless, and the whole system comes completely crashing down. To avoid default, the International Monetary Fund and EU would agree to provide Greece with 110 billion euros, or $146 billion in loans over 3 years as a kind of bailout. Germany would provide the highest sum, around 22 billion euros, of the EU's 80 billion euro portion. In exchange for this, Prime Minister Papandreou would commit to austerity measures, including 30 billion euros in spending cuts and tax increases. Something that, the taxes are typically something that you would associate with a socialist government, like what he had, but you normally don't really cut spending in that kind of context. He was forced to. The austerity measures and structural reforms, as you could probably then guess, were a temporary measure to stop finances from getting worse, but they were not popular, and remember, the entire world was also having its own issues at the time. And so, economic activity crashed, leading to a deep, severe recession. Greece's GDP would contract significantly, leading to a rise in unemployment and social unrest as their GDP plunged by around 25% from 2008 to 2013. In 2010, the unemployment rate was around 12%, but within 3 years, this was going to rise all the way up to 27%. Yes, over a quarter of the country was now going to be unemployed. Amidst public anger over austerity, Prime Minister Papandreou would call for a national referendum on a second bailout agreement under negotiation. However, instead of going through with this, he ends up calling off the referendum after the center-right opposition agrees to back the revamped EU-IMF deal. In the aftermath of this, he is forced to step down, and instead, economist Lucas Papademos is appointed to head a unity government that is tasked with implementing further austerity and structural reforms. That next year, in 2012, finance ministers would go and approve a second EU-IMF bailout for Greece, worth around 130 billion euros. In exchange, Greece had to reduce its debt to GDP ratio from 160% to 120.5% by 2020. Greece and its private creditors would then complete the debt restructuring on March 9th, which, when I describe this, was the largest restructuring in all of financial history. With finances so incredibly bad, politics were not exactly going to be an easy thing, and in a rebuke of mainstream parties, such as the conservative or socialist parties, a majority of Greeks actually ended up voting for fringe parties within this election cycle. Parties that, for the most part, were opposed to the EU-IMF bailout program and further austerity that was making everyone's lives miserable. New elections were called for in June, in which the center-right would end up triumphing with around 30% of the vote, which allowed Antonis Samaras to go and form a coalition. Samaras would then signal Greece's continued commitment to the bailout plan, which, although it would piss people off, that's really all that they could do. In 2013, Greece's parliament would approve another unpopular austerity measure, which was agreed to as part of a condition for the ongoing EU-IMF bailout. This legislation would include more layoffs of some 25,000 public servants, as well as wage cuts, tax reforms, and other budget cuts. The approval would open the way for a new series of bailout funds worth around 7 billion euros, while labor unions would call a general strike in protest because everyone was sick of this happening. It wasn't over yet, though. Fast forward around 2 years, and the left-wing anti-austerity Syriza party would win a major victory in snap elections, which would break over 40 years of tradition of two-party rule. The incoming prime minister, Alexis Tsipras, would say that he was going to push for a renegotiation of bailout terms, for more debt cancellation, and renewed public sector spending to reverse the trends of austerity that had been occurring over the previous half-decade, setting up a showdown with international creditors, and even threatening Greece defaulting on its debt and exiting the monetary union entirely so it was no longer bound to the euro. This is absolutely insane, but hey, in the same way that I have my shirts that say, "But wait, it gets worse," in this case, I could also probably create a shirt that says, "But wait, nothing ever happens." Because, yeah, that same year, in 2015, the Greek government would end up missing a $1.6 billion euro payment to the IMF when its bailout expired on June 30th, making it the first developed country to effectively default to the fund. Negotiations between the Syriza leadership and its official creditors would fall apart only days earlier. To stop people from straight up just running away with their money, which is a major problem when something like this would typically go down, Tsipras would go and earlier announce emergency capital controls, including limiting people from withdrawing money from their bank, like a hard limit of 60 euros per day, and even calling for a bank holiday, which, as you know, when the banks are closed, everything is kind of paralyzed. Still, it doesn't really work all that well, and the government is forced to concede to outside powers. Prime Minister Tsipras would bend to European creditors and would press Parliament to approve more austerity measures with more cuts, more taxes, more privatization, and more everything that was necessary for austerity, despite a July 5th referendum in which Greeks overwhelmingly rejected these terms and did not want it. The agreement would come after a weekend of talks in which a Greek Eurozone exit was only narrowly averted, and eventually, as a result of this, a third bailout is granted to Greece. Fast forward by 2 years to 2017, and tensions over Greece's third bailout were growing, as the IMF warned that the country's debt was unsustainable and that budget cuts that EU creditors had demanded of Athens would only stop Greece's ability to grow. Pretty much no matter what it is that happened, the IMF was determined that this was going to be a bad situation. So in order to delay a possible crisis that could put 86 billion euros in jeopardy, the EU representatives agreed to have more lenient budget targets, but they declined to provide any kind of real debt relief for Greece. They still had to pay things back. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Tsipras, who still maintained his job, agreed to implement deeper tax and pension reform even as he faced more domestic pressure over the weakening economy of Greece and rising poverty across the entire state. So it is then, my friends, that in the year 2018, Greece would receive its final loan from European creditors. In total, Greece would now owe the EU and IMF around 290 billion euros. At that point, the public debt of the state had soared to 180% of GDP. And in order to finance this debt, Athens promised that they were going to run a budget surplus all the way through the year 2060, as well as accepting continued EU financial supervision and having to impose additional austerity measures. The people of Greece were angry, but EU officials would hail the bailout as a success, pointing out that the Greek economy was now finally once again growing, and unemployment would fall, though when I say fall, it fell from being in the upper 20s to only around 20% in 2018, which is not great, and that is still the EU's highest at that point. Still, what I'm talking about here was 2018. It doesn't really sound like I'm painting a really nice picture. How is it that we went from that to things succeeding now? What happened afterwards? That was only 7 years ago. Well, following the implementation of austerity measures and structural reforms, Greece began to show signs of economic recovery. The economy started to grow again, and the unemployment rate began to decline. But, that all being said, the recovery was slow and it was uneven, with significant regional disparities. On that note, I need to kind of talk about this here in the first place because those disparities are going to be mentioned, and I know people are going to talk about this in the comments section. The tourism sector is something that would play a massive, crucial role in Greece's economic recovery. The country has a very rich cultural heritage. It is beautiful. It is absolutely gorgeous. I want to lead a trip there myself one day here. That is something that we were actually planning on doing this next year. It has a mild climate. It is something that is a perfect destination for tourists from all around the world. The government, as a result, would invest heavily in developing tourism for infrastructure, hotels, resorts, transportation networks, which over time would further boost the sector's growth and bring vast amounts of foreign wealth to largely coastal areas. This is where there's a little bit of a disagreement on things actually being provided to the state because the coastal areas would see the majority of development. As more and more people came into the country, the government would implement policies to attract foreign direct investment and promote innovation, which included providing tax incentives, streamlining regulatory procedures, and supporting research and development to support their own native industries. This would result in fairly solid GDP growth over the years, with the last year, 2024, seeing 2.3% growth. At the same time, that is set to be replicated this year, at least in 2025, the way that things are going right now, at around 2%, despite the whole issue with American tariffs, which appeared to have a minimal impact on Greece. Of course, me saying that, the picture is a little bit more complicated than I give it credit for. Yes, the unemployment rate has now fallen to around 9.5%, which is the lowest it has been in years. It is the first time that it has been below 10% since the crisis unfolded in the first place. And the unemployment rate is forecasted to decline to 9% by 2026 as tourism and more continues to expand. Though it still does remain the highest rate, or second highest rate in the EU after Spain. Real wages per employee are expected to rise by 1.1% on average per year, which is going to increase domestic purchasing power and consumption, which is okay. But again, Greek GDP per capita in purchasing power remains very low in the Eurozone. The average monthly salary is around 20% lower than it was 15 years ago, before the onset of the crisis. Yeah, there is great progress, but there's still quite a lot of ground to cover. And so that, my friends, in the end, is the reality. Yeah, the general image of the Greek economy is positive. Like, it is actually a good thing that things are coming back. It is even impressive considering just how far it has come after, well, falling so far. Still though, there are important structural issues that really do limit or negatively affect the state and its economy that haven't really been addressed yet and bring up the possibility of this happening again. The most important issues are inadequate diversification of the economy, an exaggerated reliance on migrant workers, and a labor crisis, as well as bureaucratic obstacles and demographic issues. To explain that rather quickly, tourism is kind of like oil. Yes, it is a boon in which it brings in vast amounts of money to the state, but it is also a curse at times. Greek politicians often avoid tackling their reliance on tourism, on real estate, and services because these are such crucial aspects of the Greek economy, where tourism alone, depending upon the statistics that you're looking at, range anywhere between fulfilling 13 to 20% of the entire GDP of Greece now. This detail of the Greek economic sector is, of course, related to its climate, its position as being one of the top 10 tourist destinations in the world, and its geographical position within the Mediterranean. Despite tourism being a source for an easy influx of foreign capital in local economies, there still needs to be some important structural steps that have to be taken to result in long-term diversification, because over-reliance on that brings about the possibility that should something like COVID happen again, the entire thing could shut down, resulting in a complete crash. On the labor note, migrant labor is something that has been both a benefit as well as, again, a curse. Migrant labor is oftentimes a massive source of cheap labor, but it presents many problems on its own, including increased social tensions, more crime, and, most importantly, arguably, by having an easy source of cheap labor, this is something that reduces the tendency to introduce new technologies that would help to replace cheap human labor with greater automation and further developments and innovations. Something that is necessary as the Greek population is aging at a rapid rate, as the younger population that grow up in it are leaving the country for better paying jobs in other parts of the EU. The negative consequences then of Greek demographic decline are, well, quite bad. First, you have a reduction in the working age population, which means that you're going to have a greater dependency upon the fewer people that remain for taxes to be able to support other people. And this, of course, means you are going to have, with time and an aging population, higher costs for pensions and other social services. That is something that, yes, can be fixed by migration, but I don't want to tie things all the way back to migration, as that is a whole other video topic right there, but that is part of the issue/solution that Greece is facing right now. Advanced technology would not only offer cutting-edge possibilities and greater expanded domestic human power, but it also is something that would greatly reduce, if not eliminate, the needs of imported laborers of various different unskilled alien migrants. This kind of development would not just help the economy, but it is also something that would help reduce social tensions that have been increasing in recent years all across Europe, and that's not something that I want to necessarily focus on right there, but that is something that will likely have to be addressed here in the future. Either way, that all being said, Greece's economy is something that is a modern story of moderate success, and all things considered, has effectively been outpacing the Eurozone average since 2021, which remains at a very low productive level increase of 0.8%. Europe, as it stands, is just not very productive, which again is probably going to be a whole other video right there. In 2025 and 2026, the Greek economy is forecasted to grow anywhere between 2.2 and 2.5%, which at that point would effectively reach or surpass its pre-level crisis of 2009. It only took 15 years to get back to that point, or 16, 17 years. Things look pretty good right now. And if Greece can just not screw things up, like it has repeatedly in the past, then who knows, really, where we will be in the next 10 to 15 years. Perhaps Greece will go from the problem child to the favorite child of Europe and serve as a shining example for other indebted states. Or not. Who knows? Really, again, anything could happen, and I don't want to go and predict something else occurring because I literally had a conversation yesterday at the time that I'm making this video about things probably popping off between Pakistan and India, and then lo and behold, I get a notification here today on my phone that India is now firing missiles into Pakistan. So go figure. That's the habit that tends to develop on this channel. Either way, my friends, that is the end of today's video. Thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends. Best of luck.